Let's see. Okay, everybody. Thank you all for joining the webinar. I know there's some other people who will be joining us, but I figure we should just go ahead and get started. Yeah, I thank you all for your patience. We've been figuring some things out. Our normal, the person who's been facilitating us for a while, Lily Swanbrough Becker, has moved on from ASAP. She's greatly missed because she did a lot of the technical stuff I was scrambling to figure out how to do this morning. But we're now getting things moving thanks to Rachel and Beth. Yeah, it's been an interesting month since our last conversation. Feels like a week. I think we all feel a strange sense of what time means nowadays. Um, I think everybody knows what's going on in the world when it comes to COVID-19. So I don't think I'm going to reiterate that. I think instead we're all here to hear probably think about climate migration and manage retreat issues. There's interesting stuff in the media right now, but I think I'll just hand it over to Vivek Shandas. He's from Portland State University, I'm going to actually hand you guys over the ball to be able to run the presentation. We're actually not going to do introductions today, and I would say, well, actually, no. If you want to do introductions, please put them in the chat box. I think it'd be good to know who is here, but I think sometimes we do spend a long time in introducing ourselves verbally, and I think we really want to get to the meat of the presentation. And we also have announcement or two afterwards for some interesting opportunities for anybody who would be wanting to pursue them. So without further ado, Rachel and Vivek, we'll leave it to you guys to figure out how to do this.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Patrick. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. My name is Vivek Shandas. I'm a professor of urban studies and planning at Portland State University. And I was asked by a few folks to just come in and talk a little bit about a project we worked on over the last year, just doing a little bit of assessments and understanding and really digging into climate migration, the question of climate migration. And since we're not doing introductions or anything like that, I will just share a screen and go ahead and get started. If you can see that okay. Great. So I'm not a social demographer. I want to start with the things that I'm not. I am not a social demographer. And I do spend a lot of time thinking about cities, thinking about the processes that actually affect the urban form in cities, as well as kind of the forces acting on cities. And so this project was really brought together as a trying to understand what are ways we could think through these questions that are coming up that have very little empirical evidence and very little direct data sets that we can draw from to be able to understand where are people moving, why do people move, what's going on in terms of climate and its role in potentially disrupting the about 11% of net migration that happens every year in the United States. So before I get into that, I want to just give credit to Julia Beckwith, who was a student who worked in my lab last summer, really helped to kind of formalize some of this work. We'd been chipping away at it in many different dimensions, though this kind of brought together a formal way of us systematically putting some of these evidence sets together. And so with that, let me go ahead and get started. My own story is actually one of migration. My parents and I was born in South India. And they, when I was about 10 years old and experiencing the roads and the kind of ecology of cities that I study, my parents moved to California, where I essentially spent my teenage years and college, and then moved around the United States a fair bit. What's interesting in terms of the landscapes that I kind of experienced, I went from seeing kind of streets filled with people to streets not so filled with people. And the landscapes that I encountered were very dramatic. And this really affected my thinking, not only of movement of people as my family did, though also in terms of what places look like. And so that really seeded early on in my life the question of why do places look different and what draws people to certain places, as I experienced as a child moving from one place to another. I counted over, I just had a little, at 3 a.m. last night, I couldn't sleep very well. So I counted the number of places I've lived, and it's about 22 for 6 months or more. And I don't know if that's a lot or that's a little, but I know when I think about it, it feels like a lot. So migration is something that I think very personally, viscerally has been central to my life. And if you're paying attention to any of the news outlets, one of the things that really becomes very evident is the amount of speculation that's happening in the popular press these days. And the place that I live, Portland, Oregon, we've been we've been hit with lots of different uh, um, news media about Portland or Seattle or Minneapolis or Duluth being places that are ideal for climate change. And so these things have been coming out in so many different forms with, in my read of it, a lot of speculation and very little actual data behind this. So what I'd like to do in kind of what I've seen here in this area of the Pacific Northwest, I'd like to, I know that you're from many different parts of the US, maybe even outside the US. I'd just like to do a little quick poll to get a sense for how important is this for you? So just a quick poll that I've launched. You might be able to see a poll that just showed up on your screen. If you would go ahead and just select, the first question attempts to ask, how much of your current professional responsibilities include climate-induced migration, just to see whether this is even something that you're actively working on right now. And the second question is essentially asks, in your opinion, how important is understanding more about climate-induced migration? I guess there's a type of question mark. So one is about how much of what you're currently doing, and the other is kind of how important is it to understand? So subtle but different questions. Leave it open for another couple of seconds here. And looks like, all right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, good. I can share the results, and can you see those? I think you can see those results, yes. So what I'm noticing is that some, in terms of professional responsibilities, some of you are working on this, so that's really interesting. Nobody said nothing, so there's nobody who's not working on this at all. And then it looks like while some of you are working on it, almost 72% of you consider this, or 18 of you consider this very important. So interesting. I'm surprised by as many people working on this in your daily responsibilities, and 5 of you actually working on this a lot. So that's very interesting to me. I'm gonna kind of take that as indication that this will be a way for us to learn a little bit more about what's happening with climate migration through your involvement. The big questions that I tend to spend a lot of time focusing on with climate, I can at least summarize in these 4. In what ways can changes in planetary systems decrease the likelihood of human survival? So that's at the big level, getting a little bit more focused on human health and well-being. Through what mechanisms do these factors interact to amplify stressors on human health and well-being? Something I spend a bit of time on. And then these areas that are really becoming more prominent and will be the focus of some of the discussion today is really how have changes in the climate system affected the movement of urban populations, and then what pragmatic approaches offer promise for reducing the impacts of human migration to US cities. So we're hearing a lot about this in the press. These are some questions that really come to my mind as I think through this field. As a scholar, I tend to go to the literature quite a bit, and this was some work that came out recently by Thober and folks who are looking at kind of the relationship between migration and environmental conditions, considerations, or stressors. And what they did was essentially look at literature and try to summarize how these different environmental factors and natural resource factors really mediate and not necessarily mediate. How many of these environmental factors are present in these studies, and how much are they considering them? And by and large, what I'm noticing in the literature is that this is not an area of robust analysis. This isn't something that I'm seeing a huge amount of literature on. I know there's groups that are starting to really think about this, though in terms of what we have to go on, it still seems relatively limited from what I can gauge. And so with that background, it's really hard for us to really be able to say anything conclusive about it. So we embarked upon a project to try to assemble what we know based on what available data there are to try to get at this climate-induced migration question. And we approached this from a perspective of modeling, where we were essentially using a agent-based model and using a combination of Python, GIS, and work that was originally done by Cutler back in 2017. We essentially developed a model where we recognize that this is an area that's really limited in terms of its available data. So we have to create a model that has a lot of assumptions, which I'll get into in a minute, but nevertheless, it's still an exercise for us to try to understand. We really built this off of a model similar to Robinson's work that essentially takes a series of inputs, population and various climate stressors, integrates those two, and looks at these direct effects on populations, both affected and unaffected, and then looks at potential climate-induced migration and then standard migration to look at spatial distribution across the country. So we note that many others have said this, that climate is rarely the only driver of migration. Instead, it's multiple drivers interact and really affect each other, and that the climate factors really are exogenous and potentially play a role as towards a measure of propensity or probability of moving. And so that's kind of the general approach that we used. Getting a little bit more specific into the model itself, we looked at a set of counties across the US. These were selected for being about 250,000, population 250,000 or more, and we really tried to array them across. We didn't get much in the Intermountain area. You might notice there weren't a lot of counties that had 250,000 or more people, but we selected these and assuming that they're going to have a broad set of bioclimatological conditions as well. And that allowed us to then start looking at these counties in terms of households or agents, which is essentially how the agent-based model works. Each of these households or agents, they get ascribed a set of demographic characteristics drawn from the American Community Survey, including age, income, renter-owner, so tenure status, home price, household members, and several others that are essentially helping us characterize that household. Households or agents in that manner, and then the census has these kind of move rates, which essentially are based on various demographic factors, distances, and networks. So how networked is a household? And we were able to draw on those data to essentially create these networks across counties and even within counties. And then some assumptions will start really becoming evident here in this model, where we create one member of a household within the county and randomly assign a member outside of the county. Using at least the available census as well as the various agent characteristics that we ascribe, we can then get into aspects of parameters where these households have particular distances between and among counties. There's a net migration, and kind of using graph theory, we come up with a radius between counties, and that distance actually is an important measure. And then climate thresholds that are applied to each of these counties as well. And I'll get into this in a minute, but different counties are affected differently by climate change, and we can come up with a climate ranking for extreme events to each of these counties. And so for the climate extremes, we used NOAA's Climate Explorer, which helps us essentially identify a myriad of factors that could increase the likelihood of migration. And then we link that to drought, precipitation, heat, and sea level rise. So these are climate stressors. So it'll be important to know that this is not a migration model as it's set up. Like there is literature out there that you might be familiar with that draws directly on existing demographic models and being able to look at those 35 to 40 million people who are moving every year. This is essentially building off of those to identify those factors that would lead to potential migration. The simulations of 32 climate models that predict from 2020 to 2090, these are kind of interval steps that the NOAA's Climate Explorer provides, and we're able to take an absolute as well as relative climate criteria for each county, which gives us essentially assumptions about the number of days above a specific temperature, drought, precipitation, and sea level rise thresholds that we set. Then we essentially also look at relative distribution, where one county might be really hot, another county at the same period might be really cool. So there's a relative difference across each of the counties as we parameterize the model. Lots of assumptions. It's a screen full of text. I don't want to go into a lot of detail with this, but there are a lot of assumptions. In essence, I will say that we ran this over 47 years. Oops, that's not 3013, it's 2013, typo. Each year is one step time interval. And then there are updates for each time step where you're essentially looking at updated climate based on the Climate Explorer, which essentially it does a lot of this work in a linear manner, admittedly limited. There's county updates on climate rankings that happens year by year. There are individual updates that happens to agents in terms of assumptions we make about home tenure as people get older. Their home tenure increases. Again, not necessarily the case, though that's an assumption we built into this. Agent's family and network, median household price are all also affected in these time intervals. And those sea level rise thresholds change over time, as well as other climate characteristics based on results from the Climate Explorer. And then the network itself, so the agent's family and the network itself has assigned probability of new networked agents emerging from year to year. And just again, in these county populations change. Agents don't learn on past, or are they able to predict the future? And then agents are sensitive, sense their environment. So that is, as it gets hotter, there is an increased likelihood of a household or an agent to actually move if they can, based on income characteristics and age and demographic characteristics. So that's essentially the model as we parameterized it as a whole. And at this point, I wish I was able to get another poll out to you, but I would really want to know how many of you have experience with an agent-based model. There are limits to what it can do, though. For running something like this, we can start seeing the kind of movement of people based on specific thresholds that we set, and then we can go in and change those assumptions and thresholds as needed, which is an advantage to a model like this. So what did we find? And I want to leave enough time, a good chunk of time for discussion as well. But what did we find? The biggest relative population growth in this, actually, I think I have a better slide than this. Oh, yes, here we go. Results. What did we find? The biggest population growth were these particular counties that we were, as we ran the model. We were able to see that there was a general pattern that played out in population growth, and then a set of reductions in population that played out across the country as well. And so that was a combination of kind of where were we seeing specific changes, and then where were we seeing specific or growth and then reduction. We were also able to look at specific migration pathways, which are county to county moves that allow us to look at which county was which counties were connected essentially. This isn't giving directionality per se. I'm sorry, this is giving directionality. We have another scenario where we didn't look at directionality and just looked at all movement of all types. This particular one is directionality, where we're looking at, for example, looking at Multnomah County to King County in the Pacific Northwest, or Wayne County shows up several times, but Wayne County going to these different parts of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York coming up. These were results that we are still trying to unpack. We have no necessarily explanations as to exactly why. It has a lot to do with the specific parameters that we placed into the model. And what this allows us to do is create a whole series of model adjustments, which we've embarked upon. Although I will admit, and I didn't earlier, this is 100% unfunded work. This is all on Sunday afternoon, essentially, that we're doing this work, because trying to fund this work, we've submitted 2 proposals for doing this kind of work. Very hard to do. So these are model adjustments we would do should we start examining, should we have funding to be able to explore some other possibilities. We can change climate thresholds, income radii in terms of how far people can move, how little people can move, the network type. Even with those changes, we were able to see that the results were remarkably consistent in terms of the places that gained and the places that lost populations. We can expand the decision-making process for households. So there's a whole field of sociocognitive theory about how people will adapt and how communities will adapt, which I think is something we have not directly incorporated, though is a tremendous area of further investigation that we can do. We can include learning from past, and maybe even to a certain extent what future events. Agents can get assigned probabilities of having, or households can get assigned probability of having experienced a past event, and kind of almost a factor of change based on past events. There's a clear linear set of predictions that are emerging from this as well, which again, there's a lot more dynamic feedbacks and other dimensions that would play out, which we haven't taken into consideration. And then of course, the social equities piece, which is often for us front and center in this work, and trying to understand what will the implications be on communities that can't necessarily move for a variety of reasons, and as climate stressors increase in frequency, intensity, and duration. There are many other possibilities based on the particularities of what a regional application might look like. One other possibility that we've really considered is, this is at the US CONUS level. What we'd want to do is bring this down to an individual region, like the Great Lakes, or like various concentrations where people are really concerned about potentially being a place where a lot of people might move for a variety of reasons, and trying to think about it from a very local data, local culture, local perspective, I think would really enhance our ability to refine these kinds of models in their application. So with that, there's many directions we can go with this. I want to kind of just for the sake of conversation, the sake of time, just open this up for discussion to you all in terms of how does climate-induced migration factor into adaptation discussions for you? What are the factors that are important? Do you see policies as potentially responsive to these concerns or these questions? Could they be adaptable or responsive to these concerns? Something I've been thinking about a lot, would an urban climate adaptation index help to advance the discussion about this work? Maybe as a result, generate some data sets that could be of some value. to folks who can build models and start exploring different scenarios? And specifically, what aspects are important when you're considering adaptation potential? That's something that is right now assumed, and we haven't. I imagine as a society or as a community, you all as adaptation professionals, or at least self-identified adaptation professionals, might have a way to think about spurning the discussion and thereby generating data, which researchers desperately need in this work. And so this is our first attempt at trying to advance some of that. There are other relevant questions that can come up certainly as well. So with that, I'll leave some contact information here. I kept this at about half an hour to make sure that I don't drone on too much about a model that is still admittedly relatively thin in terms of what it is able to say, though is a first attempt at being able to parameterize a lot of the available data sets and provides at least a backbone for us to check assumptions and revise as needed. So I'll leave it at that. And Patrick, maybe I could turn it back over to you to see if there's some questions or discussion. I can bring this slide back up because these are really two more generic and big questions that I would be really curious about if from participants in terms of does it factor into adaptation discussions now in your communities? And then would an index or some other, what else could help spurn the conversation locally for you?
Well, thank you. Yeah, if you could get back to that slide, that's awesome. This is a great presentation, and really appreciate it. You know, it puts me in mind of a couple of other models that I know of in various, you know, stages of development, and it's really amazing to see this kind of like looking under the hood. So thank you. So yeah, I think that would be great if we kind of maybe touched on those questions. Those are really great questions. I think it'll be a, you know, I'm personally curious about some of this myself. So I guess I'll start out, and then, you know, Vivek, you can follow up, you know, afterwards. But I guess I want to ask to everyone else, how does climate-induced migration factor into adaptation discussion? So I mean, we have 32 people on the calls, 31 participants right now. So I'm curious about this myself. How does this factor in? Does anyone want to start?
I'll go. This is Stephanie Dahlke with the University of Maryland Environmental Finance Center. And we're currently, just as one example, we're working on a project in the city of Cambridge, Maryland, and which is in Dorchester County, which is one that's expected to see some of the most land loss. It's already seeing a lot of land loss due to sea level rise and subsidence. So one thing that we're talking about with folks there is, you know, the county doesn't have a lot of money for buyouts, and the city of Cambridge is actually kind of on some of the higher ground in the county. So are they expecting to receive people moving from elsewhere in the county to help bolster their population, which could actually help with some of their financial struggles? But also, are they ready for an influx of new people? And what are the demographics of these people going to be? And can people afford to leave if they're starting to experience nuisance flooding on a very regular basis? So this is obviously super relevant to Chesapeake Bay communities, and especially ones that are already experiencing a lot of inequity and financial distress. Are they ready for it? Are there positives and negatives? And how does that affect their ability to pay for resiliency and adaptation or other kind of basic services in the places that are losing population especially? That's all.
Vivek, hi, this is Anna. How are you doing? I have a nerdy question for you that's not on this list. Sorry. So when you were taking the, when you were creating the assumptions and you were thinking about county to county movement, did you I missed it if you took into consideration like people moving because of sort of kin and kith and job market. Like, did you sort of take some of that into consideration? And that's, I think, where some of the complexity comes in, because if you're looking at you know, like housing markets and job markets and adding like some of those factors in to why people move and where they would move, and if they're going to move, you know, generally people don't sort of close their eyes and point to the map and find a place to move. They move where their cousin lives, where they can crash in someone's basement, especially if it's like after a shock, not just like sort of a stressor. So I was curious if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, Anna, thanks. That is how we capture the term network that I used. That's essentially the characterization of a network. Essentially has several factors, and we drew on some data. New York Times actually had a piece on migration, and they had these kind of move rates that were identified, and that was based in large part on aspects of age, aspects of, like you were saying, kind of kin. There was an income aspect to it. And this network it's really hard to be able to characterize a network. We essentially said that in the county, there'd be one person that was kin and one person outside in one of the other 82 counties. In one of them, there would be another kin. And so that is an assumption that we had, just as, you know, just as essentially randomly assigned is the way that we went about that. And there's really no other logic we could use to be able to know that, you know, one person would have a kin in a north place or in a south place. We essentially randomly assign that across the country. And should we have better data on what are the potential ways to parameterize that network, that's kind of at the core of what I believe you're asking, Anna, is the idea of what are the propensities in other places for this kind of pull factor to be activated. And the network dimension in our model is essentially the only way that we can get at that. And there's, like I was saying, there are demographic factors in there, and then some randomly assigned factors in there that are brought in. That's about as good as we could do given the complexity of what and the nuance of the question that you're proposing.
Hey Vivek, there's a question in the chat, I think, if you wanted to check that one out.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, there's a few. Oh my goodness. I have not, well, I wasn't able.
No, it's okay. I think it's actually just one. You're seeing a bunch of intros as well, but if you scroll all the way down to the bottom.
I gotcha, okay.
Oh yeah, sorry, that's me. It's more of a statement. It's not really a question, just echoing what Stephanie said about the usefulness of knowing patterns of movement from one community to another, especially low elevation community to a high elevation community. That those patterns would be really critical. But then, you know, drilling down even at the smaller scale, you know, we know that people are moving from the high risk flood zones to the low risk flood zones in the same neighborhood, just to escape flood insurance or escape, you know, recurrent inundation. And then we of course know people are moving from one neighborhood to another in the same city. And then we have attorneys telling us that they're doing lots of closings in the high elevation adjacent city, where people are migrating out of the low elevation adjacent city. But no one is looking at these patterns at all. And so the work that you're doing is really interesting. And you studied Virginia Beach. I'm based in Norfolk, Virginia.
Oh, wow.
So, you know, again, most of our movement is really piecemeal, parcel by parcel right now. But we are seeing, you know, an increase of stories of those people moving from one community to another.
Super interesting. Like this is where the work I'm hoping will compel this work to be far more regionally specific, because that's really where this needs to go at a national scale. It's interesting, but like the other studies I've seen as well, they're such broad brush strokes of this, and at a certain point it gets somewhat frustrating, because it's just you're using kind of the best data sets you can get, which aren't really even household to household per se. It's replete with assumptions. So the moment we can get into the kind of, whether it's Virginia, whether it's Michigan, whether it's Florida, et cetera, it's like, that's where we can start bringing in the, kind of resolution, I think, that you're talking about. And that's the direction I think a lot of this work is going, and where we're trying to think about supporting communities and the questions they're asking.
Hi, Vivek. This is
Hi, Jola.
Jola.
How are you? Nice to see you.
I'm fine, very well. Thank you for this presentation, really interesting. Just a question, and then this is what I've been struggling with every time I listen and go to different conferences around climate-induced migration. I find that people use this word migration as though the same thing as retreat. And I'm wondering how you've defined climate-induced migration in this work, and what exactly it means. I know you talked about people relocating from specific cities to another, and also relocating within counties. And in some of the work that I'm doing right now, I'm actually trying to separate out relocation from migration and defining that clearly what it means. And I remember just someone just mentioned now this issue of buyouts. And so a lot of those buyouts that is happening, not just here in the US, but also in some parts of the global South, what I've seen is that they are usually motivated by specific disasters. Usually there is a focusing event and it's obvious. And so you may have communities that move together, finding ways to fund themselves. You may also have the government fund the relocation. And so in those instances, it is often clear what is the motivating reason, or what is the factor making people move. But when it comes to climate migration as loosely defined, which of course includes people moving because of livelihood, some might be direct impact from climate change, others might be because of other livelihoods that have been depleted because of climate change, and therefore they move. So these entanglements between this managed retreat and climate migration, I often struggle when people present like this type of models as well. And in the model, I can see, at least from what I've heard, I can see that both issues are in there. It appears you looked at managed retreats as part of this, in a way looking at people being moved or who move because of disasters or sea level rise, potential sea level rise. But also it appears people might have moved because of other indirect impact on their life, which might also be motivated by climate change. So I'm just wondering if it might help as this model goes forward, where you can sort of distinguish these two types of relocations or movements of people, these two types of mobility. I'm writing a paper on this issue right now, trying to clarify it from a theoretical perspective, but I think this type of model can certainly help us understand what exactly is making people move, who is moving, where are they moving to, and what are those other indirect factors that we can then classify other climate-induced migration.
Super interesting points, Jola, all of them. That's exactly it. I mean, this is largely, migration here is largely based on an environmental or climate-induced stressor. Like that's essentially the compelling factor for a move, and it's not and it's essentially a move in terms of, it's a one-directional move as well, right? Mm-hmm. And so that was the idea, is that these time steps do induce moving based on what are the relative and absolute climate stressors that a county would endure, and different demographics. If you have, different demographics will kind of essentially propel that move. And so the migration in that sense is essentially the likelihood that a household or agent in this case would be affected by these exogenous factors, climate-induced exogenous factors, that would then compel a move to a relatively lower kind of climate county ranking location. And if you could follow that, it's a very blunt instrument and a definition. It doesn't have many of the nuances I think that you're getting at, which I think are sorely needed in this work. So I really am delighted to know that you're actually theoretically grounding this and trying to also then look at ways that these definitions can be better refined.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, so that's some great discussion. So we're at just wondering, we're at 2:42 Central. So do we want to go on to the second question that we had about the do you want to bring that back up on screen? I think, yeah. Would an urban climate adaptation index help to advance the discussion? So do we have any comments on that or any discussion points?
I
have a question. When by urban climate adaptation index, what is the difference between climate adaptation index and maybe like what has already been created, like vulnerability indexes?
Yeah, so I wanted to I brought this up, just a little context before I get at that, is just I wanted to get at this in part because what I've seen happen often, at least as someone watching like broad sustainability movements, environmental movements, is part of what I'm seeing is that these indices come up and they create a scoring measure to try to, for lack of a better word, simplify a lot of complex things into a set of measures. And what I've noticed about them, while all of us have probably complained or griped about the quality or the way the methodology was developed, at least those of us watching this field of kind of the cottage industry of indices that have emerged in this field, that they have in many ways allowed for a conversation to start up about what is important and what isn't important. And whether that gets indoctrinated into the index or not is another question, though I've noticed that its presence, like whether it's, the vulnerability indices that you're talking about is like, the critique I've often heard is, who are we to necessarily ascribe vulnerability to a community that can self-identify in terms of what isn't vulnerable in that context. And so with those conversations, I've seen a much more rich and robust dialogue about why is it important to think about whether it be vulnerability or, in this case, to think about climate adaptation. And so that's at least the context from which I'm thinking about this question of it encouraging a conversation dialogue about it. In this context, I was proposing it mainly because a lot of you are self-identifying as adaptation professionals, and I don't know what your go-to for knowing whether a place is ready. And I've heard the term climate ready. I've heard a lot of these terms, preparedness, and as adaptation professionals, part of what I'm really wanting to elicit from you is a kind of a pulse, trying to read the pulse on whether these kinds of these sometimes quantitative indices could help you in saying, hey, listen, city, county, council, regional decision maker board, we have been identified as nationally a region that is going to really be hit hard with this set of climate induced events and is very low, and so we're vulnerable in that sense, and we rank low in terms of our ability to adapt. We don't have a climate preparedness plan. Just to kind of pick out a few things, we don't have a climate preparedness plan. Our infrastructure is really in pretty rough shape. Our housing is very insecure. We have a lot of housing insecurity, etc. And so those things could help. Part of the reason is those things could help generate a conversation about it. I don't want to underscore that too much, but it is partly like, can that help you with your constituencies and your organizations and boards and commissions to essentially say, we need to really be thinking about this more? And would an index or some other form of characterizing adaptation be helpful to you? So that was probably a long-winded way of answering your question, but I'm just curious as to whether that makes sense now.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I mean, I think if people are trying to play around with, let me go on video. If people are trying to play around with models, and we're trying to expand and grow this field of modeling and allow it to be sort of more accessible, which, well, that also has its downside, right? Creating models from, that have bizarre assumptions, and then this comes out in the news and everyone's like, oh my God, everybody's moving to Iowa. Like, but I think kind of democratizing it and having more of these indices is helpful, because then people can play around with these models more, right? Instead of having to think through, well, what's the heat threshold and what's the pull and push factor? How hot does it have to get for someone to leave? Like, it kind of takes the mystery out of that and allows people to just create some models, which again has up and down sides. But.
I'll speak to a different aspect of that question, sort of a climate adaptation index. So some of the work we've done here at the Environmental Finance Center looks at sort of, is a municipality or a county doing best practices? And so far, most things have been about, are they doing all the best practices for water quality or stormwater? And a lot of that gets into kind of the institutional capacity. So do they have a capital improvement plan, and have they incorporated dig once strategies to kind of make things more cost effective and cost efficient? Do they have a participatory process to try to make things more equitable? And a lot of these things are like little factors that affect a community's ability to just sustainably manage themselves, right? And if they're managing things well currently, they're going to be better able to deal with future costs and, population changes and things like that. So I think there's some interesting kind of institutional capacity factors. It's not something you could pull from like census data to just generate a nice gigantic amount of indices, but I think that's another interesting factor. And there are plenty of like adaptation scorecards and toolkits out there that kind of get at this stuff. We're trying to keep it simple. Are they doing the really basic steps so that they will be able to be nimble and invest differently if they need to? And are they making sure that there's representation from vulnerable populations in these just day-to-day municipal decisions? Because that kind of indicates their ability to do things in the future. But that's kind of a different side of it.
It's super interesting. Super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of, Stephanie. So thanks for giving like some examples on that. That holistically assessing adaptive capacity is so specific to the locality. And I think, and so it is possible, like in ND Gain, they do assess that to a good extent. But when you're talking about migration, getting at that specificity becomes really important, because migration is an extreme measure.
Can you say a bit more about that? What do you mean by an extreme measure?
I just mean that I think that the way migration is viewed in most places, at least currently, is as a last resort to some extent. And so, adaptive capacity will, combined with risk, all of these things will have to be, in order for that factor to come into play, like adaptive capacity has to be significantly low. And the only way to really know on that deep level what adaptive capacity is available is, I think, to do that more detailed assessment at the local level.
Got it. Right.
So yeah, this is a great discussion. I don't want to cut anybody off here, but We have a couple minutes, and I wanted to give Jola a chance to discuss a call for papers that she and the AR Siders had. So, Jola, do you want to speak for a couple minutes about that?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Patrick, for giving us this opportunity. I promise I won't take too much of your time, but we're inviting people who might be interested in working on planned relocation or what we call managed retreats, which has been viewed as an adaptation strategy, albeit a controversial one. And so we put out this call for proposal. I can send it via the chat. It's just to tell people who are working on this issue, if you have a paper you're currently working on and you're looking for a place to publish it, you certainly can publish it in the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences. That's where we've been talking to the editor, and they've agreed that we can go ahead with this. And some of the topic we're interested in, which is a range of them, but it's really around environmental justice. So the title is Perspective on Managed Retreat, Environmental Justice and Beyond. So we're looking for papers on issues around uses of land post-retreat, when, after retreat, what happens to the land. We're looking for just examples, or should I say justice-oriented examples of managed retreat, things around communications about retreat, historical injustices around retreat, trapped populations, slum communities and discourse around resettlement and retreat, future cities and urban relocation and retreat. So things that really just speaks to the justice aspect of managed retreat, or even climate migration in that very broad sense, that hasn't been covered in a range of the publications that has been published in the last few years. So we're looking for those types of insights from people who have engaged with communities that have moved, and how this move was done, whether it was done from the perspective of the community as being just or unjust. So those are some of the things we're interested in. And I'm gonna put in the chat box right now, our information, that's Siders and myself. So if you have papers around those types of issues, just please feel free to send it along. And the deadline for the abstract is June 1st, and the full paper we're expecting by September 1st. So that's about it from me.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And yeah, this sounds like a great opportunity. So I just want to take this time to really thank you, Vivek, for this. This was an excellent presentation, excellent discussion, great food for thought. This is, we really appreciate your time. And I wanted to just make everyone aware, next month's webinar, we're going to be having Mario Ariza. He is a writer from Miami who's coming out with a book this summer about Miami and sea level rise. I'm actually going to put in the chat box an excerpt from Believer Mag from the book. It's excellent writing, so definitely take a few minutes to take a look at that. And I think the book is Disposable City, Miami's Future on the Shores of Climate Catastrophe. So it's for more literary perspective sometimes than the science or policy stuff we normally have. So if you can make it, I think it'll be a great presentation. So I'll press that right now. And yeah, we have a couple minutes. So does anybody else have any announcements they want to make to the group while we are all here? Okay. Hearing none, Rachel, I'm going to turn it back over to you since you're technically, I think, controlling this whole thing. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. I have quite a bit of background noise right now, a couple of family members in the background. So I think there's not too much of an update here on the ASAP end, but just encourage anyone who's not yet an ASAP member to join ASAP. And when you do, make sure to check the box for this group on your ASAP member profile. And I think that's all from over here.
Great, Rachel. So yeah, thanks everybody. Have a great day, and we'll hope to see as many of you as can make it on our June 2nd webinar. So take care.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Andrew. Thanks for joining.